Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another Blackbaud conference. I appreciate your taking the time to watch the session today. And thanks to Blackbaud for making the effort to record the session as well as doing the conference. My name is Bill Connors. I'm an independent Razor's Edge consultant. I've been consulting on Razor's Edge since 1998 and using the product since 1995. So some of that history with the software will come into play as we discuss the session today. So the point of the session today is, as it's labeled, talking about addressees and salutations in today's environment. They've changed how we call our constituents, what we call our constituents, how we address them, how we list them in reports has changed over time. And as a consultant on the product, I've over the past year gotten a number of calls where people have said, "Hey Bill, what's the global change we need to do, or how do we do the global change in order to update all of our addressees and salutations to something that's more modern and contemporary with today's environment?" And in thinking it through some, when I got those initial calls, I knew there was more to it than just one simple global change. And then as the calls continued to come in, I decided that rather than extemporaneously coming up with the challenges and talking them through, I ought to organize everything into a logical flow and a logical explanation as to how we should address this topic. And so that's the purpose of today's presentation. So I hope you'll find it helpful. Now, one point is that this is not a technical presentation with a lot of buttonology. There aren't any screenshots of the software. The point of the presentation is, assuming that most of you are database managers or in that kind of capacity, the point of the presentation is to help you work with your team to decide what your addressees and salutations should be so that you can then do the technical work. The technical work is actually fairly easy, and I've got slides in here to help you do that. The harder part is the thinking this through and coming together as a team and deciding what the approach should be. So that's the purpose of the presentation today. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, an addressee, of course, is the full format of the name. What we have done for years and years, decades, in fact, is a Mr. and Mrs. Robert Hernandez or John Smith or John W. Smith Jr. It's what we use on letters and envelopes and labels and reports. It includes at least the version of the first name and some version of the last name. Salutation, of course, is what follows the word dear in a letter. And historically, traditionally, that has been formal along the lines of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. For those of you, which I'm assuming now is most of you using the web view, addressees and salutations are part of a function called name formats. So that's some of the terminology to get us all on the same page. So let's talk through a brief history of how these have rolled out over time. So back in the good old days, I actually started fundraising in the late 80s and began my Razor's Edge work in the 90s. Things were very formal and very traditional. So we would do a Mr. and Mrs. John W. Smith Jr., dear Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And we would have no hesitation in assuming the gender based on the names. In fact, there was actually, I know a couple of projects I did with clients where we would take their database, take names, and we would run them through software that other company, not Blackbaud, but another company had developed that would say, what based on the first name, what the gender probably is. So it wasn't even people guessing. There was actually systematized down to software. So that's how we did things well into the 90s, into the new millennium. But over time, things have changed. Some of those changes are as follows. First of all, there has long been pushback about relegating. I'm going to do a lot of air quotes because there are words I'm going to be using today that I would love to have the time to unpack that we just don't have the time to unpack. So please excuse my use of air quotes. But there has been long been pushback about relegating or limiting women to just being the and Mrs. Certainly women have a name and they have every bit as much right as the men do to have their name be part of addressees and salutations. So that's been long a discomfort with this traditional format illustrated at the top of the slide. The second move that I noticed, especially as a Californian, is a change to a more informal culture. That the stiffness of Mr. and Mrs. John W. Smith Jr. just did not feel very comfortable anymore. That's not the way we want to build relationships with our constituents, by talking to them so formally. And so I did notice across the country, probably starting in the West and the Southwest, and has gradually moved to the other parts of the country, and my sense is in other parts of the English speaking world as well, just to get dropping this formality, dropping some of these titles, and let's just call people by their first names. The most recent change that I've noticed in the past 3, 4, 5 years is that the younger generations are trying to get us away from gender binaries, that everybody is not either a Mr. or a Ms. Um, Certainly trying to get us away from gender assumptions, and even questioning why we need to be talking about gender in most of the work. If I'm a humane society, if I'm a relief organization, if I'm uh, uh, a school, if I'm uh, an organization that provides food to those that don't have it in my community, the gender of the donor is pretty irrelevant to the work that we do. Why do we need to make it relevant by putting it into addressees and salutations? And so these three trends have caused more and more organizations. Certainly, I've noticed it as a consultant, and both in the work I do, to say, let's just revisit this format and let's start all over with new addressees and form and salutations. And so, how do we do that? Well, what I get a lot of is, Bill, what's the global change that I run? And I'm here to tell you that there is no simple global change. That the leader who's coming to saying, let's just go into Razor's Edge, which has super global change tools, and run some quick global change, that's not going to fix the issue. And so that's what this presentation is about, to help you understand and formulate the topics and how to walk through those topics with your team to do this more smartly. So, what I recommend instead is a two-prong approach. First of all, sit down with your colleagues, and you've got to do this with your colleagues. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but sit down with your colleagues and decide what your go forward approach should be. So you've got a new constituent, you've got an incoming class of students and their parents, you've got a new set of donors that you've at your end of your appeal or your acquisition appeal, and you've got their information. They need to be entered into the database with brand new addresses and salutations. Let's think about them first. And then once that is in place, then let's figure out how to apply this to our existing set of constituents. I find it far easier if you break those conversations into two different steps rather than trying to do everything together at the same time. When you have that conversation with your team, here's how I'd recommend you do it. First of all, I find I love fundraisers. Literally, some of my best friends are fundraisers. I consider myself a fundraiser, but fundraisers generally are not good about the details and the intricacies of thinking this through. So, if you're the database manager, I recommend you come to the table with a draft. Have a plan to discuss. Don't just bring the topic to the table, bring ideas to the table. So, that's what I mean by a draft. You, as the database manager who are most familiar with these topics, you prepare a draft based on what we're going to talk about in the next 40 minutes that we have left. Then the team discuss it. And I'm going to give you some ideas of how to think about this and how to discuss it. But you discuss it as a team, you reach a decision as a team. You don't do anything in Razor's Edge until somebody documents those decisions and gets confirmation from the participants that yes, this document does in fact represent what we want to be doing, and only then do you sit down to the software and do the implementation. So one of the first parts of this discussion is, what addresses and salutations, or ad sals as most of us call them, do you need? Typically, you need very few. I think it's generally a mistake to set up a system that says single informal, single formal, couple informal, couple formal. We don't need so many options. We need a few options that reflect the formality and reflect the style that our organization wants to use. So, what I like to do is have the primary addressee and salutation, of course. No big deal there. Everyone's familiar with that. I like to use what are called a main constituent only addressee and a main constituent salutation to address those situations where there's a couple, but I just need to address the main person, the volunteer, the alum, the board member, the contact. I don't need a volunteer set and a board set and an alum set. I can just use that one set to cover all of those situations because the real point is I just need to know who the main person is, and then you might need one or two more, like an additional format for donor recognition purposes, if you don't want to use, or the constituent doesn't want you to use the primary addressee format. So you don't need a lot. You come up with the types or the situations in which you need them. I'm going to focus the rest of the conversation about then what goes into those fields. So if you have a primary addressee, how do you discuss and decide what the primary addressee format should be? So I'm going to generalize this by talking about just addressees and salutations, but this format is then applied to those particular instances in your database. So these beginning matters, these introductory points are just as important as to what follows. And so we do need to walk through these before we talk about first name, last name kind of topics. So first of all, I'd recommend you make this an institutional decision, not just a departmental one. Because if the development director says, yep, I'm on board, and then the executive director says, I don't like it, then you're going to have to start all over. Or if the advancement team is sending out communications one way and some other part of the organization is sending out communications the other way, it looks like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So the advancement team should be coordinating with the communications team and whoever else does emails and mailings to make sure that you've got an institutional policy here and not just a department policy. Second of all, this is a quick point, but in the good old days when we used to run annual reports, people wanted the name formats in the reports to be listed the same way. So it looked like it was organized and consistent and thought through. That kind of thinking has to go out the window. I might be in there as Bill Connors, someone else might be in there as Mr. Charlie Hunsaker Jr., and that's okay. Number three, is really a lead in to point number four. Point number four is we want to honor our constituents' wishes. If a constituent says, I prefer to be listed this way, I prefer to be addressed this way, it's incumbent upon us as ethical fundraisers, as relationship oriented fundraisers, to do what the constituents ask for. Number three is just to protect ourselves. If someone asks for something crazy, we do need to have in policy the statement that says we ultimately deserve or retain the rights to determine what's acceptable or not. But normally we don't have any problems. And so point number four is we honor what the constituent asks for. So you may have, if you've been around this business long enough, you may have seen a format such as Mrs. Robert Hernandez, and that might strike you as incorrect. Well, for widows of an older generation, that may be exactly what they want to be called and what they should be called. And so if an older woman asks to be named after her husband, like the format Mrs. Robert Hernandez, we need to respect that. It's not wrong, even if it's not our normal preferred format. And so when you get these requests from your constituents, they need to be documented. In Razor's Edge, I recommend a note with a note type of named format request, and that you document who asked for what when, so that you've got that history. Moving on then, we need to consider our organization's culture, geography, constituency, and leadership in making these decisions. I'm not here to tell you today what your ad sal should be. I'm here to help you think through what they should be based on who your organization is. So I'm assuming if I'm the New York Opera in New York City, the New York Met, probably with the high society, wealthy donors there, they probably use a much more formal approach than a local grassroots environmental org in Southern California does. And that's okay. We don't all need to be the same. So consider the culture of your organization, the culture of where you are located geographically, what your constituency is. So if you're a small school, for example, you might really already be on a first name personal relationship basis with your constituents. Your ad sales should reflect that. If you're a large international organization, you might need to be more respectful and formal. And then finally, leadership. There are still some leaders of a generation that are going to want this to be formal. And so don't make a lot of decisions based on what you think it should be if your leadership is not going to support it. And then the final point I would make as we then jump into the content of this is I was just talking with someone this morning, completely coincidentally, about this. And she said, I get 20 minutes into this, I get overwhelmed and I stop because I don't know where to go from here. And so, what I recommend you do when you tackle this is that you just deal with one small piece at a time and then you let it grow. And that's what I'm going to walk you through. So we're just going to start with an unmarried single person, just their addressee. And we're going to get what that figured out for our organization. And then once we know what our addressees should be for single people that are not yet in our database that we would be adding new, then we'll move on to the single people new to our database and what their salutation should be, etc. And so, the expression, how do you eat an elephant? The answer is, it's kind of a gross question, sorry, but it is an expression. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, one small step at a time. And so this is how I suggest you break it down. So for the single people, their addressees, what are the things we need to think about? The first thing we need to talk about in Razor's Edge speak are titles. Miss and Master were actually correct, appropriate titles back in the day. For those of you who don't know, Master used to be the proper term for a young boy. It was the equivalent to Miss for a young woman. Of course, those titles, I would say, for most folks are old-fashioned and we can write them off. But what are you going to do for your organization around Mr., Mrs., and Ms.? A lot of organizations are dropping those. They're certainly dropping making gender assumptions based on first names. So that's where I see a lot of let's just get rid of these. That is clearly the theme that I'm hearing around the country is let's get rid of and stop using gender-based titles. There is a non-binary or a non-gender specific title of MX, and you can use it if you want to. Again, this is a decision you need to talk about with your team and make a decision. I'm hearing and seeing less interest in MX and more interest in just dropping titles altogether. Now, one of the mistakes that I see is that folks will say, okay, we're dropping the gender-based titles, so let's just drop them all. So everyone is going to be Bill Connors, Charles Smith, Betsy Hernandez, Yoko Lee, etc. You need to stop and think about that. There are other titles that you may want to keep, what a lot of folks will call earned and honorific titles, like doctor or rabbi or colonel or governor. So I'm not a fan of dropping those titles, but you need to decide if you're comfortable calling doctors and colonels and the clergy by their first names or not. So I would encourage you to think about that. Then we move on to the names, the first names and first names alternatives. Sure, obviously we need first name, but what about nicknames? Like for me, my formal name might not be surprised to hear, is William. It's not Bill, but I do everything under Bill. I joke, if you send me mail addressed to William Connors, then I'm going to think you're suing me because I only use William for legal purposes. Obviously, other people do use their first name. What are you going to do if someone's first name is provided as initials? How are you going to handle that? And then as we move on into this conversation, what about the folks who use their middle names instead of first names or nicknames or as nicknames. And so this is an example of why some knee-jerk, let's just do one global change to our database doesn't work, because even something as simple as the first name is complicated by these factors. And I'm sorry, don't shoot the messenger here. Yes, it's complicated, but these are the kinds of things that you need to think through as a team. Now, if you're interested, I have done a sample policy and procedure that's on my website where I take these issues, these points, and I put them together in a sample policy and procedure document that you're welcome to copy and steal if you want. That's available on my website, and I'll tell you how to get there at the end of the presentation. But these are the kinds of details that you and your constituent entry folks need to be thoughtful about. And then finally, for most of us, finally, suffixes. So again, with the throwing out of the titles, I hear a lot of initially, let's throw out suffixes as well. I'm not sure that's such a good idea. There are suffixes that have important roles that need to be considered. For example, junior as a suffix literally tells us the difference between one person and another, the difference between the father and the son. That's probably not a title, a suffix we just want to get rid of. So be thoughtful about suffixes and don't just automatically assume that everyone should now be in your database just based on first name and last name. For those of you that are schools or educational institutions, then you will need to add this fifth component, which is thinking through how you're going to put the alums class year into the ad cells, usually into the addressees, not the salutations. And then for those of you that deal with parents, I'm seeing more and more the years of the students being put in the addressees of the parents preceded by a P, which makes this all the more complicated. So moving on, this is what you need to do to decide what the addressee should be for a single person. Once you've figured all of that out, it's pretty easy then to extrapolate from the addressee decisions to the salutation decision for a single person. But you need to walk through the same 5 points for the salutation and decide how those 5 points apply to the salutation for single people, so that when you've got a mailing like you see illustrated on the slide, it makes sense. This is an example of what not to do. We typically don't want an informal addressee and then a formal salutation. Once you're done with the people, then we need to move on to the couples. With the couples, you need to go through the same 5 questions, but now with both people. So the first, the middle, the nick, the suffix, the address, the years. You need to consider all of those with both people, but you now have these additional complications. First, who's a couple? Now, this is really a data entry strategy as to when 2 people in a relationship constitute a couple. I've been with my partner for 15 years. We've never gotten married. We are absolutely a couple, even though we're not legally married. Someone who's been dating someone for 15 days, probably not yet a couple in your database. And so you have to figure that out. Secondly, and this is generally the biggest, hardest conversation, is when you've got their name there in the addressee and salutation, who goes first? And clearly, unsurprisingly, the idea that the man always needs to go first is really going out the window. People are considering other ways, and I would say in the razor's edge, the best way to do it is who's most important, who's most relevant to your organization. If it's an alum, if it's a board member, if you know this is the person who has the money and who makes the giving decisions, that's the person who should go first. But you'll see there on the slide other ways that other organizations are making that decision as to who name goes first. Now, there is a quick point I want to make, which is there is traditional etiquette that not only does the man go first in the traditional format, such as Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, but there's also a statement that says a man and his name should never be separated. I know it's sexist. I didn't come up with it. I'm just telling you what traditional etiquette says, what traditional protocol says. And you'll see there's a link there where you can go read about it if you want to know more. So that's why you might have seen in the past Mr. and Mrs. Robert Smith and then Jane and Robert Smith, because based on traditional etiquette, it's not appropriate to put Jane between Robert and Smith. Now, you can throw that out the window. I don't care. I've certainly thrown it out the window as far as my personal and professional practices, but you might want to be aware that it exists and be thoughtful about your constituency, whether people are going to care about that or not. Another thing to think about with couples is, are you going to use an ampersand or are you going to use the word and? Not a big deal. Make a decision, be consistent. And then you have to decide, well, what if the two people have different last names? So my partner, again, we're not married. He's of course kept his own last name. I've kept my last name. So what are you going to do for us? What are you going to do for a traditionally married couple where she has taken his last name? How are you going to put them together, especially when she might come first because she's more important or she's the alum, not him? Sometimes, frankly, I think even with people with the same last name, it's just easier to list them separately with an and or an ampersand in the middle. So don't be afraid to do that. There's nothing wrong with saying, oh my gosh, this has gotten so complicated with first names, years, nicknames, suffixes. It doesn't it looks silly when I try and do it so that the last name is at the end. Well, fine. Just do one name first and do the second name second, even if the last names are the same. And then finally, something you need to think about with Razor's Edge is, what do you do if each of the constituents has its own record? Do you use the same format for the same couple in both records, or does one format apply to one record because of who's in that record, and then a different format applies in that record because of who's in that record? Okay, so these are the things you need to think about for couples. Focus on the addressee. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. First, middle, nick, suffix, etc. And then the 5 issues with the couples that I've just articulated here. Really trying to lay it out for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Once you've got the couple's addressees established, then you can go on and talk about the couple salutations. Again, once you've done the addressee, usually the salutation is pretty obvious because it needs to mimic the formats and the decisions made for the addressee. So for example, here is something you would not want to do, where the addressee uses the word and is informal, while the salutation is formal using the ampersand. Don't make decisions like that. All right, so let's move on. There might be other issues with your constituencies or just in Razor's Edge in general I haven't thought of that you need to add as well. Don't be shy about doing this. I don't claim perfection and all knowing. So if there are other points, by all means, incorporate them in. But in summary, what you and your team should have done at this point is to decide, for a new single constituent, this should be their addressee. For a new single constituent, here should be their salutation. For a couple addressee, couple salutation. And this should be your go forward approach with new constituents. When you have that policy and procedure decided and documented, there certainly are tools in Razor's Edge to help you enforce and to expedite that work. I'm not going to read through all of these. Blackbaud actually has done a nice job in the knowledge base telling you how to do these steps and giving you step-by-step instructions. So go to the Blackbaud knowledge base at kb.blackbaud.com, look up these article numbers, and they'll give you the step-by-step instructions. But this slide talks about some of the ways that you can help enforce this policy going forward. All right, so all of our conversation thus far has been about what to do for going forward. In some sense, it's been done theoretically or philosophically. You're just sitting around a table saying, here's what I think we should do going forward. I recommend that because it's easier to do when you just deal with a clean slate. But now we have to address, what do we do with the constituents that are already in the database? I've made the point, hopefully by now, that you can't just do a single global change and update your database and go back to business. It's far more complicated than that. So what do we do with those records in our database? If you'll notice the next bullets, including on the next slides, that they are bulleted, they're not numbered, because these are all ideas that you need to hold at the same time and think through at the same time. This is not sequential like the previous slides. These are ideas that you need to think about all at the same time. So here we go. For the constituents already in the database, do you know why some of them already have the ad sales that they do? That those constituents have reached out to you and said, I prefer to be Mrs. Robert Smith, or I prefer to be the Smith family, or I prefer to be Robert, Linda, and Charlie Smith, whatever the case may be. Do you have that documented? If you're able to identify those, then you probably want to preserve those and not unilaterally say, we have a new policy, we're overriding our constituents' preferences. Number two, be careful about assumptions here. I was having this conversation with an organization, and the conversation had just started. This was a smart person who brought this idea up, but he said, probably all the editable ad sales in Razor's Edge represent constituent expressed preferences, while all the formulas are those that were just globally added. And we had to talk about that for a minute to realize that probably was not a safe assumption. So for example, I do lots of conversions and lots of imports. And generally other systems don't have formula-based ad sales. They have text. And so the only way to get those text ad sales from those lists or other systems into Razor's Edge is just to bring them all in editable. It is too hard to figure out what the corresponding formulas are for thousands of records. And so we don't try, we just bring them in as editable. So be careful of any assumptions like that you make about your data, because they may or may not be true. Hopefully by now I've illustrated that one global change is not only not going to get the job done, but a series of global changes may also not get the job done also. If you think about the details and the points we've just talked through about developing the pieces of the names that should go into addressees and salutations, it's far more complicated than just a formula, because some people we use the first name and some we don't. Some people we should use the title and some we don't. Some couples have the same last name and some don't. And so the ability to reduce this to a formula or a set of formulas is going to be very hard. Your inability to do so is not a reflection on your intelligence. It's a reflection on the real difficulty of taking all of these situations and trying to boil it down to one rule or one formula or a set of formulas. So don't try and do that either, or if you do try, be prepared for it to be very difficult. So a set of global changes might not work either. Another thing to keep in mind, are you actually getting any complaints? Do you really need to actually change your database? So yes, culture has changed. Yes, this is something that should be top of mind and that we should be thinking about. But do you actually need to go into your database and change all the records? Maybe not. That's a valid conversation to have. Or maybe there's a subset, a large subset of your constituents that you don't need to change. Another way to think about this is ask the constituents. Ask them what they prefer and then update accordingly. Don't make global changes or global updates. Just ask them what they want, and if they express a preference, then reflect it, respect it, but otherwise don't worry about it. I was talking about this at a conference just a few weeks ago and talking about communicating to constituents after making this change, letting them know you have and not to be surprised when they see their names in new ways and to let you know. And someone came up to me afterwards and said, why don't we ask them before we make the change so that they can weigh in rather than us making these changes and then having to correct them? So, either way, the point is communicate with your constituents would be an option rather than just making the change. Okay, so send them a postcard, send them an email, and let them respond electronically on a form you set up on your website. Another way to do this is to prioritize and only do the most important constituents, such as your board members, such as having your major gift officers go through those that are assigned to their portfolios and have them think it through or have them have the conversations. It may make sense to actually do some exports from Razor's Edge, see the names, put in Excel another column, and then fill out that column with formula IDs or text versions of what the name should be, where you just go through them and say, based on what we know about this person and the fields that are in their record, this is what their new ad sal should be. And you're just going to have to do the most important groups manually. Or maybe you can do some global changes. You're just going to have to do sets of global changes. So you're going to have to write a query of the single people who don't have gender-based titles, who do have suffixes, and create all of those situations in a query, and then do the one global change that's appropriate for them. And then try and think through the next situation and what that query is, and then do the global change for them. That would be another approach. And then, as I talked about, communicating to your constituents, when you make these changes, if you make these changes, communicate, 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 especially their names that are going to show up on donor walls or donor lists that are going to be publicly distributed. Make sure the constituents know you've made these changes. Put notices in your newsletters. Put notices in your your emails. It doesn't have to be a special communication like the bullet on the previous slide. It could just be communications in your notices in your existing communications. But let your constituents know that you're changing your names and be ready then to respond to their requests. Okay. So once you've talked these things through and decided with your team, you may be overwhelmed. And I get it, and I'm sorry. I'm just talking about the reality of the situation again. Don't shoot the messenger for bringing this to your reality. And I'm not trying to argue that this is so hard you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying it's not as easy as many people think, especially people in leadership who don't think about data like you and I think about data. So if we're going to do it, please do it thoughtfully. Bring the people together, do it systematically, make thoughtful decisions. Be careful as you query and globally change or do update imports to your database. Just please be thoughtful about this. This is legitimately a difficult project. And then if you do make changes, review the data before you go public with it. So as you start pulling lists to do mailings, take the time to review the names on the mailings to make sure they look correct. As you continue to do your acknowledgement letters, take time to look at the addressees and salutations. As you prepare a listing for an annual report or for a donor wall or for a newsletter, pay extra special attention to review the names in a way that you might not have before. Okay, so this is how I think you should go about thinking about it. So we've been talking about all of the things to think about when you're meeting with your team and deciding what your approach is going to be for your existing constituents. Again, doesn't have to be all or nothing. But when you decide what you want to do with your existing constituents, there are tools in the Razor's Edge to help you make those changes, very powerful tools. Again, the difficulty with this process are not the lack of tools in Razor's Edge. The difficulty is the decision making about what you want to do and how you want to thoughtfully and carefully do it. So there are two sets of tools in Razor's Edge that enable you to make these changes. You can use one, the other, or both. They're great tools. I use them all the time. The first set of tools would be queries and global changes. So of course, the idea here is simply you write a query of the records you want to change, not the whole database. We're clear on that now, but a subset of the database of whatever size of 15 records to 1500 records, whatever. And then you say, okay, let's make the new addressee, the primary addressee be this formula, and let's make the new primary salutation be that formula. Works great. The knowledge-based articles are there, step-by-step instructions. I don't need to reinvent that wheel. I've given you a couple of hints. Go do that, fix those records if that works for you. The other approach is when global changes won't work and you need to be able to review the records and then come up record by record what their addressee and salutation should be. Now, of course, you can sit there in Razor's Edge and make the change on the screen, but that's a lot of clicking back and forth to do that. One other way to do it would be to export the name and ad sal information from Razor's Edge to a spreadsheet, add a few extra columns, put into those columns the new IDs or the new formats that you want, perfect that, review that, make sure it's perfect, and then do an update import back into Razor's Edge to assign those new values. Again, Blackbaud's done an excellent job in the knowledge base of explaining how to do each of those technical steps one by one. I've listed them there for you. You can look at them up and you can do that. So yes, it's going to be work to make these changes in your database, but the bigger work is to make the decisions that we've talked about. Okay. So with that, again, the point is don't do this. The point is do this carefully, do this thoughtfully. To bring this back to conclusion, this is not a simple global change. And know that your peers are going through this process as well, and they have to do the same work as well. So it's middle of the day when I'm recording this presentation, and purely by coincidence, I was on the phone with a school in Southern California this morning, and they started asking me these exact questions. Our fundraiser on staff is getting mail addressed to the husband because we've been doing it the traditional way. What do we do for doctor? Because we don't really want to drop the titles for doctors. What do we do for our transgender constituents when we need to be changing how their names and their ad sales are set up in records? So I should have recorded them as a prelude to my presentation this afternoon. So a lot of folks are dealing with this. You've got good company. I have put on my website not only a copy of these slides, but a sample beginning policy and procedure document that you are welcome to download and steal whatever applies and modify for what works for your organization. So if you go to my website, billconnors.com, you don't have to log in. You don't have to give me any contact information. I had no idea you were there. You can just go take whatever you want, plus other stuff that I have there. It's of interest to help you along this journey so that we can update our system to reflect the current cultural environment in which we find ourselves. Thanks again for your time today. Thanks again for listening. Wish you well. Look forward to seeing you down the road. Bye-bye.